right. So first of all, many thanks to Roger and the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I study international relations, and it's really an honor to attend such a multidisciplinary conference. The aim of my paper is to develop a fairness-centered conception of justice as a minimalist morality for a contemporary Tianxia world order. And I draw on Professor Walz's distinction between maximalism and minimalism. I make two key arguments. The first is to show Confucian fairness as a maximalist morality rooted in the Chinese Confucian culture. And the second is to suggest how this maximalism might give rise to a minimalism with universal relevance. First of all, a word on the concept of Tianxia itself. I use the concept of Tianxia somewhat differently from Professor Zhao Tingyang. I conceive of Tianxia as a geographically delimited international society composed of political units and other actors bound by a common set of rules and institutions and embodying certain moral principles and practices. This conception makes it possible, I believe, to identify varying kinds of historical Tianxia orders with different geographical scopes, political arrangements, and ethical embodiments. And it makes Tianxia scalable and adaptable. Now, the Chinese concept that bears the closest resemblance to justice in the Western intellectual tradition is Yi. Roger has provided an excellent definition of Yi here. And it seems that Kongzi has introduced two different meanings of Yi. First, as a personal disposition or virtue, and second, as social values or standards by which personal conduct is evaluated. And he further proposes Zhang as the inner source of Yi. So internally, Yi, as the Confucian notion of justice, is grounded in the psychological foundation of Zhang, practiced through universal but differential care or graded care. And externally, Yi is manifest through Li, ritual propriety. As we all know, Li is not just rights, but also propriety, and more broadly, social norms with a psychological foundation. Moving on to the question of principles of justice. Confucianism contains a strong principle of fairness and a subdued principle of equality. And I contend here that Confucian fairness is an excellent example of a maximalist morality rooted in Chinese culture and society. And there are two main conceptions of fairness in Confucian thought: fairness based on status, virtue, or merit, and fairness based on the reciprocity of obligations. Among the Confucian scholars, among Confucian thinkers, Xunzi, I think, is an outstanding theorist of both conceptions. And there's no need for me to elaborate this here. I'm making the case for the Confucian conception of a fairness-centered justice as a maximalist morality in Chinese history. I will now try to illustrate this maximalism with an example drawn from the relationship of China's Ming Dynasty with the Koyo Dynasty on the Korean Peninsula. In the paper, I quoted two rescripts the Hongwu Emperor, the founding emperor of the Ming, sent to King Kongming of the Koyo. They illustrate the emperor's conception of justice as relational fairness. the emperor simply assumed his superior status relative to the current king and presumed their relationship to be one of a sovereign subordinate hierarchy. He touted his merit as a founding emperor and based his claim to a Tianxia order in part on their merit. So in his mind, his status, virtue, and merit combined to endow him with an unquestionable hierarchical superiority over the current king. And such a subordinate relationship was fair and just. And more important, that hierarchy was supported by a second conception of fairness based on the reciprocity of obligations. The Hong Emperor offered to treat the Koyo with the same humaneness as he would treat China itself. And in return, he expected the Korean king's subordinate obligations of loyalty and integrity as his outer vessel. So can this maximalist morality produce a minimalism that is universally applicable? I draw on the scholarship of Professor Richard Ned Lebow, who is one of the foremost international relations theorists today, and contend that fairness is a universal principle of justice, even though it is developed and expressed differently in different cultures. In Justice and International Order, a book Ned and I have just published, we argue that all principles of justice across the East and West can be reduced to the principles of fairness and equality. We recognize that this is a bold claim, but it is our claim. And there are striking similarities in Chinese and Western conceptions of fairness. To start with, both adopt status, virtue, or merit as key criteria of fairness. And Chinese and Western thinkers alike invoke fairness to justify hierarchy and defend it as beneficial to everyone for roughly the same reasons. The Chinese argument foregrounds the reciprocity of obligations. Here, I can give an example of Mengzi's thinking on Wang Dao. Wang Dao literally means the kingly way, but is perhaps better translated as humane authority. It is akin to the Greek concept of hegemonia. Hegemonia is, in the Greek context, the ancient Greek context, is a relational hierarchy in which those at the top gain honor in return for providing practical benefits to those at the bottom. And Wang Dao is the approach whereby the king uses his virtue to put humaneness into effect and make others deferential. So there's a striking resemblance again between Wang Dao and hegemonia. I now turn from theory and history to policy and apply my conception of the fairness-centered minimalist justice to the Sino-American relationship. My contention is that such a moral minimalism might help to ease the escalating rivalry between the two countries and apply the first conception of fairness based on merit or virtue to the easing of their status competition, and the second conception of fairness based on the reciprocity of obligations to the management of their strategic competition in Asia. First, status competition. The quest for status is a central source of Sino-American tension. Here, the problem is that America's claim for hegemony in East Asia clashes with China's quest for equality with the US. So how can fairness help? As a first step, the two countries should dispel the notion that only hegemony can satisfy their status needs and realize that there are multiple pathways to status. They should then devote foreign policy efforts to skills and fields at which they excel. The US could emphasize rights-based initiatives, rule of law, human rights, democracy, and China should do the same by stressing community-based actions, peace, harmony, and so on. And the two countries should engage in fairness-based competition by enhancing the merit or virtue of their policies. That is to say, they need to develop policies that can bring benefits to themselves, as well as to regional international societies, and by grounding those policies in appropriate ethical frameworks. We know that there are many areas in which both countries can improve their domestic and foreign policies. As for security competition, I suggest that the American and Chinese security orders in Asia can be reconciled by an approach based on the Greek concept of hegemonia and the Chinese concept of Wang Dao. Both of these concepts, as I've noted a moment ago, are manifestations of the second conception of fairness based on the reciprocity of obligations. So what do these countries need to do? For America, it means discharging its responsibilities to its regional allies and partners, while encouraging them to improve relations with China. And for China, it means improving relations with neighboring countries without compelling them to choose between Beijing and Washington. So rather than a binary strategy dividing Asia between Chinese-led and US-led spheres of influence or opposing blocs, a common hegemonia Wang Dao strategy has the potential of leading to an intermention community of regional countries friendly to both powers. I am aware that this is a bit idealistic at the moment, given the intensifying competition between the two countries in the Asia-Pacific region. But as theorists, we need to think both, and we need to draw both theoretical and historical lessons for contemporary problems. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhang. And let's wait for some questions. If you would like to raise your hand, please. Oh, Dr. Ems, please. Yeah. And then Professor Sun. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your paper, Zhang Feng, and your work on fairness. One idea that occurred to me that might be interesting is that the difference between the word fair and just, that fair in English is an aesthetic term. You say that she's a fair maid. You talk about the weather is fair. You know, that the word fair is very much an aesthetic term, where aesthetic is putting together difference. The word just really has to do with law and right. And so that's a rational idea as opposed to an aesthetic idea. And so the difference would give you the difference between equity, where grandpa gets a glass of wine and baby gets a glass of milk. And there's an equity there, as opposed to equality, where both grandpa and baby get a glass of wine or a glass of milk, you know. So I think it's just interesting that you guys have gone with fairness, and that's real good idea.
Thank you very much, Roger. These conceptual distinctions, you know, the trickiness of conceptual distinctions, the various concepts associated with justice have also exercised me greatly. And here I have been greatly assisted by my co-author, Professor Ned Labau, and him I'm largely following him here. And the basic contention here is that he's taking a broad view. He's having a broad conception of the concept of justice, and he thinks that if we want to talk about principles of justice, right? I'm also aware here that after reading your paper and the paper of other scholars, it may not be such a good idea to focus on principles so much. But if we want to focus on, if we want to talk about principles of justice, then perhaps across the East and West, the major principle of justice can be reduced to fairness and equality. And then we give quite tight conceptual definitions to these two concepts. And you're absolutely right about the connection between equity and fairness. And in fact, in some other in some disciplines, for example, psychology, the word used to mean fairness is usually equity. So we are also aware of that. Anyway, thank you very much for pointing out these conceptual distinctions to me.
Okay, and then Professor Sun Xiangchen.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Zhang. Yes, it's a very interesting presentation, and you told us to think about the conception of the fairness, and you told us maybe in different civilizations they are very similar, similarity between the conception of the fairness, and so maybe we can think about the conception of the fairness separate from their background. But just as you show, they actually, they have a different cultural background, and maybe the principle is the same. But if we think about the implementation of the fairness, they are still cultural one. They are still, the conflict between them. So yes, we have the minimal one. We have the same conception of the fairness, but the result is the same. We are still, in a conflict world. Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Sun. I fully agree with you, actually. And also, we made the point that even though the principle of fairness, or the idea, the concept, the notion of fairness may be present across different cultural traditions, the precise manifestations and the historical development of the notion of fairness will have differed in different places in different epochs. I think that is absolutely true. So part of my work here, including this paper, is really try to engage in kind of cross-cultural dialogue with some implications for international relations and for Chinese foreign policy. I used the example of the current Sino-American rivalry, Sino-American competition at the moment. Are there any? So a good question is really, are there any principles of justice or principles of foreign policy that the two countries might agree on, and might on this basis develop some policies that can help achieve accommodation between these two countries. So one of the arguments of this paper and of the bigger book that I've written with Ned is precisely to show that if both countries adopt a more careful and conscious understanding of fairness in managing their relations, that might reduce some tension in the relationship. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Any more questions?
Can I have one?
Okay, Professor Feng? Yeah, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So, Professor Zhang Feng, in my work, I have written some paper on the four notion of global justice. They make a distinction between the Western notion of global justice, like John Rawls. Those fairness largely based on those rights, human rights, and procedure. And the Asian concept of the global fairness largely is concerned the goods. So for example, return stolen heritage, kind of get this corrupt official money back, and or get those, if the Western country get talented people, they should globally should impose global tax, repay back to developing country. So all those West Asian concerns, those fairness, are largely concerns and the very concrete goods. It's goods based. So when I analyze those two different kind of really philosophical different foundation of the justice, it seems to me it's difficult for you to reconcile United States and China when come to based on notion of fairness, because if you use as long as you deploy the concept of fairness, and those two countries use this concept, go to different directions. So this is my comments. Well, like you have your criticism.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate your question. I do think, of course, at the moment, the two countries, China and the US, think very differently about fairness in their relationships. I think probably, as I noted, one of the big problems, their conceptions, is really about status, this respective status in this region. It seems to me that America is thinking, it's fair. It's only fair for it to claim hegemony or leadership or primacy, whatever in this region, since it has, claimed this and possessed this since the end of Second World War. But China is increasingly unhappy with this, and China thinks it's really unfair for the US to claim this and for it to dominate this region as if nothing had happened since the end of Second World War. So it wants at least equality, some kind of equality, and equality is status marker as equality with the US. So there's a big conflict between the two countries in their competition over status. So in the paper, I noted this conflict in the paper, and then I suggested that actually a fairness-centered strategy competition can actually help to ease their competition. And how they should do so is one way for them to do so is to change their conception of how they can achieve their status. And one of the contention is that they should disassociate status with hegemony. And then they should look for multiple pathways to status. And one way in which they can look for, they can achieve, they can find multiple pathways to status is to develop the virtue and merit of their foreign policies. And to do better, in other words, to do better in their domestic and foreign policies, and to contribute more to regional and international society. In this way, both of them will gain status in the eyes of regional countries, international society. In this way, both countries can gain status, and so they can sidestep the thorny issue of whether it's an area of American hegemony or Chinese hegemony. And the other conception of fairness, I think, is very important. The second conception of fairness I discussed, namely the conception, the idea of reciprocity. Reciprocity is very important for achieving international obligation. In Confucianism, the old notion of reciprocity is reciprocity of obligations. it may be a bit difficult to talk about obligations in international relations, but the reciprocity of interest, reciprocity of benefits are very important to international relations. And if the two countries, if the foreign policies of the US and China can, if they can focus on how they might achieve reciprocity in their relations, I think they will be able to do a good job of reducing the current tension. Thank you.
Okay, we still have 2 more minutes to go. Any more questions?
Yes, may I ask a question, please?
Okay, Amida.
Yes, my question is this, that we get Rawlsian concept of justice as fairness, and their roles talks about, say, acting under the veil of ignorance. And that is something which I think brings this Rawlsian concept of justice very close to, say, minimalist understanding of justice, because it is whenever we are trying to invoke fairness, we are always acting under the veil of ignorance. And I would like to ask Professor whether, when he was talking about this de-escalating the Sino-American conflict, of retaining one's society, one's status and other things, whether this concept of veil of ignorance will be of any help in de-escalating this kind of, competition in status.
Thank you very much, Professor. An interesting question. I'm not sure whether we can apply Rawls's notion to the veil of ignorance in Sino-American relations. In fact, we certainly Ned, but I also we reject Rawls's presumption about the veil of ignorance. We think it's the wrong presumption to have to develop a supposedly universal theory of justice. In fact, the veil of ignorance is based on I think it very much comes from Western liberalism, the version of Western liberalism. And you really can't develop a universal theory, a comprehensive theory of justice, say a theory that should apply to China as well as to the United States, from the presumption of the veil of ignorance. It's very much, it looks like a liberal theory of justice for the use in the United States, then universal theory of justice for use worldwide. Thank you.
I guess as well. That's why I raised this question.
Thank you.